Eva, and I will be exploring the topic of Cleopatra as myth by analyzing the short story One of Cleopatra's Nights by Théophile Gautier. First of all, it's important to understand that the conception that we have of Cleopatra in our day and age is not exactly true to the person that she was. It's important to understand that our conceptions of her are largely constructed, and as Stacy Schiff would say, we remember her for the wrong reasons, namely as a wanton temptress or shamelessly seductive woman. We also often see this sort of portrayal in the modern day media, in films, in video games, even on slot machines, and of course, throughout several texts, one of which we'll see later in detail. Now, where do these negative conceptions that we have today come from? Basically, they're rooted in the negative propaganda that was a key part of Octavian's propaganda war. Octavian, who wanted to claim power and become Roman emperor, was one of Cleopatra and Mark Antony's key enemies. Thus, he needed to use a certain rhetoric to push the Roman people against Antony and Cleopatra and make them be on his side. So, what we know about Cleopatra doesn't actually come from her, it comes from these Romans. And the Romans, of course, wanted to portray this negative image of her, so we have to keep that in mind when we're viewing the documents. In fact, the documents themselves create a constructed identity for Cleopatra, deeming her sexual, cruel, foreign, tricky. So what does this really mean? It means that the Romans could not separate the idea of a powerful woman from that of a dangerous one. So what were the main basis of the Romans' arguments? Of course, they used this negative rhetoric against her, but the negative rhetoric was built on two main points: Cleopatra as a foreigner and Cleopatra as a woman. First of all, we have to keep in mind that at the time, Romans were very ethnocentric, and they liked to think of Rome as the center of the world, even though it wasn't at the time. They thought of Egypt as this far-off land, barbaric, eastern, magical, unknown, and they thought of Rome as the epitome of civilization. However, at the time, Alexandria, a city in Egypt, was actually the center of education and research. So we see how the Romans used their own rhetoric here, even if it wasn't true. There's also the issue of misogyny. In Egypt, it wasn't uncommon for a woman to rule. In fact, it had happened many times before. However, in Rome, a woman could not assume power unless it was in the guise of being behind her husband. Thus, Romans sexualized Cleopatra, making her seem like this wanton seductress who cast her charms over Mark Antony, and that it was only for this reason that she was able to have power over him. Cassius tells us, "For us as Romans, rulers of the largest and best part of the world, to be disparaged and downtrodden by an Egyptian woman is unworthy of our fathers." He goes so far as to say, no Roman should overlook a woman who would consider herself equal to a man. Now, I wish to explore these Roman stereotypes in the short story One of Cleopatra's Nights by Théophile Gautier. This is a short story that was published in 1845. Just to give you a brief synopsis of the story, one day Cleopatra languishes in boredom and tells her favorite slave of the desire that she has for a new adventure or a new lover. A young hunter by the name of Maimoun has pined after her his whole life, and one day he finally has the audacity to shoot an arrow into her chambers. Now attached to this arrow is a note that says, "I love you." Finally, when Cleopatra discovers the identity of her young admirer, she tells him, "You can have one night with me, but it will cost you your life." So, how has Gautier constructed Cleopatra, and how is this similar to the ways that the Romans constructed her in the past? First of all, Gautier is influenced by an ancient author who was named Sextus Aurelius Victor, a historian of the 4th century. He said that Cleopatra was so lustful that she often prostituted herself, and so beautiful that many men bought a night with her at the price of their lives. Now, this is the basis for his story, and he constructs upon it various themes with which he focuses on certain qualities of Cleopatra. These are her beauty, her cruelty, her sexuality, and her Grecian identity. Now, when it comes to beauty, Gautier references it time and time again in the story. I'll just give you a few examples. He says, "She had the most charming head, one look of which caused the loss of half a world, an adorable, a divine head, the head of the most perfect woman that ever lived, the most womanly and most queenly of all women." Later he says she was perfectly beautiful and perfectly well dressed. So we see that she is an ideal for the beauty of woman, and he also talks about her riches. However, there's a problem with this sort of beautiful description of Cleopatra because, quite simply, we don't really know what she looked like. We also have a citation from Plutarch, who is actually one of the closest sources that we have from the time, who says, "For indeed her own beauty, as they say, was not in and of itself completely incomparable, nor was it the sort that would astound those who saw her, but interaction with her was captivating, and her appearance, along with her persuasiveness in discussion, and her character that accompanied every interchange, was stimulating." Thus we see here that Plutarch is focusing more on her intelligence and her ability to rule. However, Gautier does not focus on these aspects. Now, an interesting thing that Gautier does is to focus on Cleopatra's Greek identity and step away from her Egyptianness. In fact, in the text, Cleopatra seems to hate Egypt, and she says, for example, "Egypt crushes, annihilates me. The sky with its implacable azure is sadder than the deep night of Erebus. Never a cloud, never a shadow, and always that red, sanguine sun, which glares down upon you like the eye of a cyclops." Later she says, "And moreover, this land is truly an awful land. All things in it are gloomy, enigmatic, incomprehensible." She even references herself as having a Grecian identity when she says, "With love, this grim and arid Egypt would seem to me fairer than even Greece, with her ivory gods." Thus we see there that she's comparing things Greek to things Egyptian, and obviously preferring those Greek things. However, this is very strange because at the time, Cleopatra's ancestors had been in Greece for many years, and she probably thought of herself as Egyptian. Finally, perhaps the most important themes in Gautier's story are sexuality and cruelty. We see largely that Cleopatra is this object of desire in the story, and that the concepts of sexuality and cruelty are intertwined. For example, when Cleopatra says, "You can have one night with me," she says it will cost you your life. So there we see those two elements come together. At one point, Gautier describes the following: "Cleopatra desired to dazzle her voluntary victim and plunge him into a whirlpool of dizzy pleasures, to intoxicate and madden him with the wine of orgy, so that death, though freely accepted, might come invisibly and unawares." So there we see again that we're focusing on her aspect as a seductress, and she's quite sexualized yet again. Another aspect where we see her cruelty is when she wishes to kill one of her servants because he does not immediately find Maimoun. Her first instinct is to throw him to the wild beasts. While he is saved, this shows that her true nature is this cruelty. And finally, the most important description of her cruelty is how she acts when her lover poisons himself and dies. Mark Antony comes in and asks why there's a corpse on the ground, and she says quite simply, "Oh, nothing," with a smile. "Only a poison I was testing with the idea of using it upon myself, should Augustus take me prisoner." In conclusion, we can see that Gautier continues on with many of the stereotypical Roman ideas that have been established in the past. He uses Roman sources, and they're the main basis for his story, even though they might not be true. And so he constructs this myth of her revolving around her beauty, her sexuality, and her cruelty, all negative aspects, as we have seen from Roman propaganda. Gautier does not describe Cleopatra as being the intelligent, capable ruler that we also know that she was, but instead focuses on her as a sole object of desire. However, there is one difference between Gautier and his Roman predecessors in that he tries to identify her as Greek, while the Romans focused on her otherness or Egyptianness. Thank you very much.